I've been asked to talk to you about writing scientific papers, and I'm going to divide this brief talk into three. The first we'll discuss the preparation of the manuscript, and the second we'll talk about how you choose the journal to which you submit the manuscript, and the third will just be some general tips and tricks about doing all that. So let's start at the beginning with writing your manuscript. Let's just discuss why you want to write it. Now, I know as a young student, perhaps if it's your first paper, you really just see this as a step onwards to your degree or to the rest of your career. But you have to remember that what you write, if it's published, stays there forever. And when you're long dead and gone, people will take that book down from the shelf of a library or download it from the internet and read your paper. So it's really important that it's good. And it has to be as right as you can make it. And it also has to be something that's useful. And a lot of research, I'm afraid, is not useful. So let's imagine that your project has been well planned and you have conducted the necessary research. Well, in doing that, you probably wrote out a protocol or a plan at the beginning, and that protocol or plan will be very useful to you when you come to actually write the paper, because it will contain a lot of the background information, references, rationale, and even some discussion aspects. So if you've written a good protocol or a good plan, it's really going to help you with the paper. It's particularly going to help you in terms of the introduction and also some of the methods, because in your protocol or plan you will have written down what methods you used in your studies. It could be a laboratory study where you investigated something at the bench, or it could be a clinical or epidemiological study, or even a review of literature. But you would have said at the beginning how you did it. Of course that will have changed, but it's a great start. So if we think of a paper as it's finished, it's divided conventionally into several sections. And the most important section is actually the title. Because in truth, that's what 99% of people will only ever read. As people scan this enormous scientific and medical literature, they look for titles that are interesting. And most titles, as you know, as I'm sure you've done it yourselves, are not so interesting and you don't look at them. So your title is really important, but perhaps we'll come back to that. So I think you'll have a provisional title at the beginning, and maybe you'll have an opportunity to reflect on the title at the end. It's certainly a good thing to have a very punchy, concise and attractive title, but not too overstretched. Many of the journals don't like you to have a title that claims too much. We call this declamatory. So it has to be both exciting but also truthful. Anyway, we'll come back to the title a bit later. So then the paper is divided into the abstract. Now, if those few people who decided to look at your paper do actually read it, again, I'm afraid most of them will only read the abstract. So the abstract is really, really important, and it's probably best to leave that one to the end. Many of the journals are very strict about length of paper, and so the abstract will usually have a limited number of words. And there are two forms of general abstract, although we will discuss this a bit more later. One is the narrative abstract, where you simply write down from the beginning to the end the background, the methods, the results and the conclusions, and the other is a structured abstract, where each of those is a separate section. More of that later. Next is the introduction. By the way, some of the journals nowadays, they like to have some detail right very early on in a paper. They like to have the funding source, who paid for it, and the reference to that grant, if it comes through a grant, early on. Clinical papers Now it's essential that any clinical trial or study is registered on an open access registry. So all clinical trials must have ethical and scientific committee approval, or ethical committee approval, and they should have a registration number, and that registration number will derive from an open access website, and some journals like to see that right at the beginning at the abstract. Let's go down to the main part of the paper, and just to emphasize that medical and scientific publishing has changed a lot in recent years, and now increasingly, and I think it's a good move, we have open access, freely downloadable, but web-only journals. Some of them are not freely downloadable, and that is a problem, because particularly in a resource-limited setting, you may not have the money to buy the article. So increasingly, we are pushing to have open access papers. And anything, for example, that our unit here in the Faculty of Tropical Medicine, in the Wellcome unit, anything that we publish from Moru has to be open access, so you should all be able to read it. This is an example of an open access journal. It's one of many journals in the PLOS family. These papers are all open access, freely downloadable, but there's no print version. Here's another one, again from the PLOS family. Some of these journals, excuse me, are relatively easy to submit to, and some are quite difficult, and some are very expensive. I'll come back to that again. This is the more conventional paper. This is the New England Journal of Medicine, widely regarded as the leading medical journal. It has the highest impact factor. This is a conventional print copy, but also there will be an online version. And now more and more, as you publish your papers, you find that there is an online version. In fact, many journals will publish the final accepted draft copy. So there will be two versions on the web. The first is the final copy in the way that you submitted it, in a Word file usually, with the illustrations as you sent it to the journal. And then later on, the article will be formatted to be similar to that appears in the print copy. And the final download, usually as a PDF, will look very much similar to the journal. Here's an interesting couple of journals, just to point out that whatever you write, it stays there forever. This is a journal I've been looking at recently. This one is, when was this one published? 1942. And it still has the same sort of structure, the same introduction, methods, results, discussion, and the abstract at the front, just the same as today. This is an even older one. This one is 1927. So very few people are alive today who were born when these papers were published, but we still use them. They're very important. So anything you publish stays forever. And anything that your name is on, you have to share the responsibility for that paper. This is very important. If your name is on a paper, you are responsible for its contents. Some people think of publishing as a sort of reward for working hard and good behavior, but later on, if it wasn't a very good publication, or it was proved to be wrong, people say, oh well, I didn't really have very much to do with that. You can't do that. You are responsible if your name is on the paper forever. Forever. Okay, so back to the manuscript preparation. The first part of the manuscript after the abstract is the introduction. And this sets the scene for the paper. It describes in brief, why this is an important piece of work. What does this contribute, and what was the field like before you published the paper. It may say in the introduction, or you may say in the introduction at the end, briefly what your paper contributes, but really the introduction is to set the scene, set the stage for your paper. And the introduction, as I said, should probably have been written in the proposal or something very like it. Next is the materials and methods of the paper, and this will describe literally what it says, what you did to get the results that you are going to present next. It varies enormously. Imagine you're doing an epidemiological paper. Well, you would want to describe the site, the location, the whatever geographical or demographic features are important with respect to your paper. Perhaps it's a laboratory study, then you might want to describe the methodologies, the reagents, the equipment, if there were any experimental animals involved, and so forth. So this is almost like a recipe for cooking, and you should describe precisely exactly what happened. Now, sometimes you are going to use methods or techniques that have been well described in other papers. So it's often not necessary to repeat all those. For example, in our group here in Moru, we have a very productive pharmacology laboratory, and we publish a lot of papers on pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, and so forth. Well, these involve drug measurement, but if the methodology for the drug measurement has been published elsewhere, you can simply refer to that and give a very brief description saying that the method was exactly the same as in another paper, and these were the performance characteristics of the assay in your particular study. Sometimes you're describing something new which has never been done before, and that's in fact why you're publishing the paper. Obviously then you really do need to give the details. Now, in the methods section, it's very important that you describe in detail how the assay performed, or in a clinical trial how you arrived at the sample size. So there's often a subsection in the methods describing the statistical aspects. So, for example, in order to detect a 30% difference in, I don't know, height between two groups, we needed to study so many patients or subjects in order to have 95% confidence and 80% power to detect the difference that we set out. That's just an example, but it's important that you do describe the sample size. It's quite important also that you give very clear descriptions of exactly what was done. It's sometimes very boring to write a complicated methods section of a laboratory paper, and it will often need several goes, several repeats to try and make it digestible. I know that most of you listening to this have been in the library, and you will notice that a lot of people in the library have their heads on the desks, sleeping soundly, and that's often because the methods section was just simply too difficult to get through. So it's not easy, but you really do need to try and communicate in clear language, which can be followed, exactly what you did. It is just like a recipe for a cookbook, and the person reading this should be able to follow your recipe and hopefully get the same results. Okay, that's the methods. Results. Well, this is the key part of your publication, your proposed publication or paper. So that's the thing you've been working on all the time, and you should be very familiar with them. But when you've finished your studies, you need to sit down and analyze all the work in the way you described in the methods section. and you need to be able to present it again in a way that's easy to follow. It's really important that scientific papers can be read easily, and in my experience I find that often they're written in a very dense and difficult to follow way. I think writing a paper is a bit like driving a car. When you start, it's really difficult, it's very stressful, and you don't do it very well. And gradually, with time, you get better at it. So when I come to the last bit about tips, one of the tips is going to be get somebody else to read it repeatedly. Preferably somebody who has experience in writing these things, but not involved closely with your work, so that they can give you an objective view. We'll come back to that. So in the results, you have a choice of how you present information, which roughly divides into a narrative where you write in text, tables where you present things in tabular form, and diagrams. And some journals are quite restrictive about what they will publish. And of course the print journals, let's say like New England Journal of Medicine here, the print journal, they're going to spend money when they publish something with colour. So here we have a colour photograph. That probably cost the authors rather a lot of money. So in a print journal, they don't really like to publish colour unless you wish to pay for it. You might not wish to pay for it. This is one of the advantages of the online journals, which don't really have a problem about length, and they don't really have a problem about colour. Colour's great. If you can include colour, it makes it much more interesting. The graphics, both the tables and particularly the diagrams, are really important. They really help people to understand what you've done. So it's worth spending a long time thinking how best to present your work, particularly on the tables and the diagrams or photographs or pictures. The more you can have, in a sense, the